Welcome to Sputnik, orbiting the world with me, George Galloway.
And me, Gayatri.
It was a shot that resounded across the world. Gavrilo Princip, a young Serbian nationalist, stepped forward on a Sarajevo street and assassinated the Archduke Franz Ferdinand exactly 100 years ago. The Archduke was the heir to the Austro-Hungarian crown, and the hapless fellow fell victim of the rising tide of nationalism within the ramshackle empire, which was in danger of falling apart at the seams. But the empire had powerful friends, principally the burgeoning power of the new Germany, forged by Bismarck only just over 40 years before, but already emerging as the great continental power.
France, which had been crushed by Bismarck in 1870, panicked at the possibility of Germany on the march again and called on its ally Russia to come to its aid. She called on Britain too, which was initially reluctant to join in, but belatedly, when the invading German crushed neutral Belgium, Britain too joined the fray.
And so the First World War began. Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Turkish Ottoman Empire versus Britain, France and Russia. It would quickly envelop the world. Joining us today is our own house historian on matters of war, Max Arthur OBE. Max, thanks very much for joining us. Your best-selling, stunning book, Forgotten Voices of the Great Wars, now sold 500,000 copies, and it's going like hotcakes where I bought that. And this tells the real story. But for the viewers who haven't read it yet, was it really all about the Archduke Franz Ferdinand?
I think it was the first sparkler in a great bonfire which was to come, really. Anything could have lit that torch, really, anything. I mean, I think if a Serbian had trodden on a Austro-Hungarian soldier's toe, it would have started some sort of... There was too much adrenaline pumping from so many countries which had very large armies, which had not seen war since 1870. The British had their own fights in South Africa, but small pennies, really. But I think in the vision of what, in the lives of the people at home, many I've spoken to, many of the veterans can remember as children watching the men returning from the Boer War and in their reds and looking grand and horses and things. And somehow they thought, this is the image that maybe one day I can take on. So from the British side of things, there was a great readiness to go into war. And I remember talking to someone, he said, he was a man then in his 80s or 90s, and he said, he was at Oxford and he was down for the summer and insisted on getting into uniform so that he could do his fighting and be back for the Michaelmas term in October. And that is everyone
it'll all be over by Michaelmas.
It'll be over by Michaelmas, which is an even better line than that. But, you know, there were so many intrigues going on, so many treaties that had to be so-called verified or abandoned. But, I mean, Russia was a big, powerful force. That frightened the Germans. Once the Russians mobilised...
Huge army. Huge army.
Absolutely gigantic army.
And France relied upon that. I mean, France was, in a sense...
Very much so.
Squaring up to people with the thought of someone else's army doing most of the fighting.
Yes, that's happened a number of times in their history. So it took the Russians 6 weeks, really. But, of course, the Germans then realised, oh, gosh, this is going to be bigger than we thought. So their term was really, I think, somewhere in the back of their heads was always not just to conquer Europe, but to take over Russia as well. I mean,
even then, even before the
mineral
Bolshevik
contents, the
Revolution,
oil
and so on.
contents, everything that Germany wanted could have been supplied through Russia. Yeah.
So this Lebensraum before the term was coined was in their mind.
But you can imagine the number of conversations must have gone on between Austro-Hungarians, the Serbs. They were just going to belittle the Serbs, whatever happened. It was just an excuse, really, to get this, again, fairly giant army into action. It meant that the French then had to do something about it. The Belgians remained on this sort of neutral plane and didn't quite know where they were. And so, really, although they were very brave when the Germans swept through, it was a futile defence, really, and only the French really held. But I don't think people quite realise that in 1914, that war could have been over in 1914, won by the Germans. They pushed through at a remarkable rapid rate, as they did in the Second World War, and drove them to Dunkirk. Here, the British held them at the Marne, actually with a number of Indian forces, which never get mentioned. There are probably about 100,000 Indian troops holding them there as well. And then slowly, for the next 4 years, a war of very, very harsh attrition went on, slowly taking the Germans back to Berlin. But it was 4 years, George, 4 solid years. And the fact that I've checked recently was it's about 460 young lads have been killed in Afghanistan. That was the average loss of life on the British forces every single day of the war. Every single day. So when they started in the beginning, the Times were putting lots of photographs up, and they realised after a while, you know,
just couldn't.
They couldn't cope.
This attrition and that level of loss changed Britain forever, didn't it? I mean, let's look at I was going to call it banal, it's not really banal, but how many women, therefore, then never got married because all these men had been killed and therefore never had children, and we never got the benefit of the efforts of these men and the children they never had. How did it twist or distort British history? I
think greatly, and I still think it's with us. I mean, you know little of this, being leader of your party and things, but you have to somehow look now for leaders, and they're quite hard to find. Natural, charismatic, who you would just go along with because his sheer charisma, his sheer demands, which were tempered or thought through or sensitive, you followed him. These men are rare. Many, so many are killed on the Western Front. I'm doing a book at the moment on a young lad of 20. He was a young lieutenant, a captain of Harrow, you know, everything ahead of him, poof, gone. And I lived in Asquith's house for many years, where he'd heard of the death of his son on the Western Front. Born to the leadership, born to the world of politics, knew it inside out, backwards, killed by a single bullet, you know. And you think, what a waste.
They had no idea of what was ahead of them, most of the people going to the front. They might well have studied the American Civil War, which was 35, 40 years hence or behind them, but which nonetheless showed the sheer casualty, scale of casualties that such a war of attrition and with the new technology and so on. But they didn't, did they?
They didn't. 600,000 killed in those years. And no, the photographs were there, brilliant photographs, the dead, the maimed. But I suppose always in the back of a soldier's head, having been there, is it ain't going to be me. But even so, not to show more clearly what was ahead of them, what a machine gun could do, you know. Just put a cabbage up and just run it through. That's what's going to happen to you, you know. And it was a machine gun which changed, in many ways, everything. But the heaviness of the artillery, the world had never seen. You know, you could drop it, as they did at Jutland, over a 12-mile distance, with accurately onto another ship. Those bombs are almost as strike-proof as they are now. So we had no concept of the reality of the war which we were going into. Our last encounter was against guerrillas, who we call guerrillas, in the Boer War. You know, they didn't fight as regiments. There was so at battalion level, we conducted quite good wars. But suddenly the generals who'd been active in the Boer War suddenly then had no longer 1,000 men to look after. They had 20,000, 30,000 men, which they had to move time and time again at speed, often detaching many of them and losing many of them. But the only tactic they knew was to advance after heavy bombardment.
Whereas war had swung in favour of defence, hadn't it? This technology argued that actually the man sitting defending something rather than trying to move forward was the man to beat. Going back to the Archduke, most people have forgotten that the Austro-Hungarian Empire ever existed. I've described it as ramshackle. How ramshackle was it?
I don't think it was that ramshackle. It was a benevolent sort of despot that was looking after it. He was not loved, the heir to the throne who was killed. And they all thought he'd married beneath his class, and so she was ordered on all occasions to walk behind him. So I suppose in many ways the loss of him to that country was probably not as great as it should have been, because it meant the old man stayed on. But of course he was quickly seduced into an attack on Serbia, and that the others could not accept.
Serbia was a real live, potent threat to them.
Absolutely, yeah.
The Serbs proved then, and subsequently in the Second World War, that they were very formidable fighters.
And since. Yeah.
And since.
Now, war comes with propaganda, of course, and about the German side, it was said that they were behaving extremely ruthless. They were raping nuns and throwing babies over tower tops. To what extent is that
in
true?
Belgium, yeah.
In Belgium, in the neutral Belgium, of course.
Gosh, if you want to get a group of people off the ground and moving quickly, tell people about the assaults on women, on children, and you'll get mass crowds anywhere. Most armies kill civilians somewhere along the line. They have to, because they're not sure what repercussions of passing by someone would be, because the communications were still there on the telephone. So let's kill them. There were undoubtedly atrocities in Belgium, but the way the propaganda worked was, oh, we can't have this. And the English are very prone to defending the innocent.
Is that what triggered the British to...
Not quite.
Well, it kind of pushed Britain into the war.
Yeah, it did.
When some of the arguments in the cabinet were against it. Max, we've run out of time. I must say, it's been reissued, your book.
Yes.
500,000 copies sold. It deserves to sell 500,000 more.
Thank you.
I must say, it's a fantastic piece of work.
Lovely.
Our own historian, Max Arthur OBE. Coming up after the break, Dutch historian Dienke Hondius on slavery, Europe and blackness. I promise you, you won't want to miss it. Welcome back to Sputnik. The European empires grew vastly rich on the ghastly trade of enslaving other human beings, chaining them, throwing them into the holds of leaking, verminous ships, and sailing them thousands of miles to work as beasts of burden, the sole property, just like his cattle and his sheep, of their owners. Slavery, largely, though not wholly, died out, but the racism which underpinned it never did.
Britain was, of course, the preeminent European slaver, but the Netherlands, nowadays synonymous with liberal values, was a brute slaver too, and perhaps first in the race to racialize all discourse. They did invent the concept of apartheid, after all.
Our next guest, Dr. Dienke Hondius, teaches in Amsterdam, but writes powerfully across the world on slavery and its twin, racism. She's written a new book called Blackness in Western Europe, and I'm glad she joins us now. Dr. Dienke, thanks for coming on the Sputnik. I haven't read your new book yet, but I did read your heritage slavery guide to Amsterdam, and I thought to myself, we could do with one of these here in London and Bristol and Glasgow and so on. So slavery was around a long time. Most of the European empires were deeply involved in it. Tell us how you think, and this is what I think is the thesis of your new book, how slavery has never really gone away. It's been replaced, in the sense, with this kind of racism, this kind of fear of blackness.
We are involved in a lot of debates about racism today and anti-racism and how to fight it, what forms it takes. But to understand how it developed, we have to go away from the 21st and the 20th century and really go back to the 16th century when black and white people first met. It is in those first meetings that European supremacy, white superiority feelings have developed and somehow remained intact for a very long time. And this has not been very visible within Europe. Here in London or in Bristol, as you said, or Liverpool, or in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam and in Middelburg and in Rotterdam, the history of slavery remained very invisible. All the decisions were taken here in Europe. In all the beautiful houses, in the offices here, those decisions were made, but the enslaved people themselves were not here. So the color line remained not completely, but virtually intact. And that made it easier for white Europeans to continue that long history of enslavement and the slave trade. And after the abolition of slavery in 1863 and in Britain in 1833, this history was more or less forgotten. But traveling to Europe from the British colonies and from the Dutch colonies remained very, very difficult. And so both Britain and the Netherlands and also France remained virtually white. And it is that whiteness that has remained intact and that has kept the idea of whiteness as extra beautiful, extra powerful, extra natural intact for a very long time. Until the 20th century, then we see the post-colonialism growing, but only then, only later in the 20th century do we see a real change. And then both the post-colonial presence enters Europe, but also racism comes back to Europe. And now we have to deal with that. So
prior to the 20th century then, blackness and slavery were a synonym, really. I mean, there were no black people living amongst us. We never met one. But we profited from the existence of black people.
Yeah. What I show, if you see the cover of the book, is not a slave, is a black servant. A beautiful boy, or could be a beautiful girl. So there was a very selective black presence in Europe. Very few people were allowed entrance, usually as beautiful children, who were then made the black servants in beautiful homes here in Britain, but also in Scandinavia and in Germany and in Austria, everywhere in northwestern Europe.
And how were they treated?
Well, we know still very little about that, but since their presence was so exceptional, they were able to develop friendships, and they were accepted as trophies, really, you know? As special gifts. I don't know how you can, maybe as a kind of pet. You can compare it to that. So one merchant would give a little child to the other as a kind of gift, as a special gift to treat.
In the 20th century, all that changes. There begins to be, especially in the second half of the 20th century, big movements of people from the hitherto colonized and even enslaved countries of the people we used to colonize and enslave. And the impact of that on European society was what?
Well, for the first time, the empire came back into Europe. And, you know, white people have to deal with the presence of black people and of Asian people then, from then on. So that is quite a change. And people of your generation, of the generation of my parents, can still remember the first time they saw a black person or an Asian person. If you interview people, white people, they will still remember that.
Why is it so hard to deal with that? I mean, you wouldn't remember the first time you saw a red-haired person.
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question. Why is that so?
Why is it so impactful?
I think images about black people and Asian people had been around for those centuries, but not actually living persons. No? Very, very few. So there is no tradition of ordinary interaction, common living together. Just, you know, that is still recent. That is still a recent phenomenon. So it still takes getting used to.
And is it because, this is my untutored thesis, that having enslaved and conquered and colonized people, you have to persuade yourself that you are superior to them. Otherwise, how can you justify taking them and taking their things? And having persuaded ourselves over centuries that we were the master race, it's very difficult now to treat equally those that we formerly colonized and enslaved.
I think that is very likely. Nobody gets over centuries of colonialism just like a snap of a finger.
What about looking at it for a minute from the other side? You might be better placed for that. If white people find it difficult to deal with the relatively recent presence of large numbers of people of colour, how do people of colour feel being in the presence of a great majority still of white people?
Do you want to answer that?
Well, the thing is that we're talking specifically about black people, but the Dutch in specific also enslaved Indonesian, specifically from Java, and they transported them to Suriname, amongst others. So there is definitely a sense of, I feel very connected to this topic anyway.
I mean, when you go into a restaurant, for example, and almost everyone there is white, do you notice that?
I do very much.
And do you feel that they're noticing your presence?
I have a very high consciousness of that, of being the only Asian or a woman of color and in some group or setting, and especially being born in and living in the West, actually in the actual country that colonized my family's country. It makes me even more aware of it.
What did your researchers, Doctor, tell you about that particular point?
Well, it's very good to stress the element of slavery history in Asia, because that is something we know still very little about. When we think of slavery and the slave trade, we think of the Caribbean, and we think of the movement from West Africa to the Americas. But the Asian empires were also full of this history of enslavement and of the slave trade, and that has not really been addressed. In my book, I show that, and also in the walking guide for Amsterdam, we show that the same families in Amsterdam had shares both in the East India Company and in the West India Company. So we can locate that in the same houses along the canals in Amsterdam. So there you see that the starting point and the investments and the insurance companies were, you know, they put money in the West and put money in the East. Now, in anthropology and in history, that have become very separated fields. But when you bring it back to the cities in Europe, you can see that it is a very connected.
Same owners.
Yeah, same owners.
I always say, I mean, I say it as a joke, but it's real, that many white people are afraid of black people. But I always point out to them that the black fellow has got far more to be afraid of you than you have of him. After all, it was people like us who enslaved people like him. And he's here because of that. Are we ever going to reach a stage where we'll go into a restaurant and we won't notice the colour of the people there?
I think to deal with this history, we first have to recognize the impact of colour, of blackness, and of just simple skin color, the impact of that. We first have to recognize that, and then maybe it can become less important. You talk about fear. I think most white people are not so much afraid of black people, but they have a problem dealing with black and Asian people as adults, regarding them as full-scale adult human beings.
As opposed to children.
Yes, the image really is one of the child, a sort of permanent child. White people have a even. Yeah, but really a sort of childishness, and that also explains the idea that white people feel superior and in teaching and you know.
Well, yeah, I mean,
all of that.
The British Empire went to Africa and farther afield just to teach them how to be like us.
Yeah.
Dr. Dienke, best of luck with that book, Blackness in Western Europe, and thanks for coming on the Sputnik.
Thank you.
And now it's your turn to tell us what you think through the portals of social media. What's rattling, Gayatri?
Oh, What a Lovely War, the film from 1969. Was it really all about the Archduke Franz Ferdinand? Fiach Moriarty replies, it surely was not. It was to do with an arms race, ego essentially. And Roger the Dodger answers, like most war, it was about power, money and egos. Had very little to do with what concerned most ordinary people at the time. The history of slavery and Europe. What do we actually know? Rebecca Grant replies, many settlers in the West, who are the product of European slave system, know nothing, actually. And A2Z replies, earlier, common public used to be direct slaves, but now they are being managed through puppet governments. Well, that's it for this week.
Now, we two might be three by the time they next see us together again.
Well, do please keep in touch with us anyway on Twitter at RT_Sputnik, and on Facebook you can like us on Sputnik on Russia Today. It's goodbye from me, Gayatri.
And from me, George Galloway. It's been marvellous.